All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Security Compass webinar. Today's webinar topic is scaling threat modeling beyond stride and data flows. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Raquel Rodriguez, the events manager here at Security Compass and your host for today's webinar. Before we get started with the actual content, I'd like to give you a quick overview of Security Compass. For those of you who may not be aware of us until today, Security Compass was founded in 2004 and began with a team of experienced penetration testers. Today, we have come far and work with many large enterprises globally to manage their cybersecurity risk through balanced development automation. We have three key offerings. Our flagship product, SD Elements, enables organizations to deliver software quickly and reduce costs through automation. Our modular role-based e-learning solutions empower organizations to embrace DevSecOps, and our strategic advisory services offer expertise in cloud security, pen testing, and red teaming for a better security posture. Let's quickly go through some housekeeping items. As you might notice, you've all entered the session on mute to reduce background noise. Second, a recording of this webinar will be available after today's event. You will receive an email with the link to the recording, and we will also be publishing it in the resources section of our website. Also, we encourage everyone to raise questions. Please submit your questions into the Q&A chat, and we'll address them during our Q&A session. And lastly, if you would like to follow up with us, or if you have a topic you would like to see covered in a future webinar, please email us at contact@securitycompass.com. Like I mentioned, today's webinar topic is scaling threat modeling beyond stride and data flows, and I'm pleased to have here with me today Dhruv Chandra, Head of Cloud Governance and Compliance at RBC, Spencer Koh, Offensive Security Professional at Reddit, Ihan Tech, VP of InfoSec at Cyber Electra, and Altaz Villani, Director of Insights Research at Security Compass. Thank you all for being here with me today. So why don't we get started? Altaz, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks Raquel, appreciate that. So I hope that Dhruv will be able to join us. If not, we hope everything is okay. We'll just continue on with the discussion. And if he joins us midstream, that's perfectly fine as well. So what I'm gonna do is let me share my screen here and let's get the conversation rolling here. We're going to be talking about threat modeling today. And if we consider our current context from the perspective of threat modeling, we've really evolved from this idea of having well-known threat vectors to the idea that there are evolving threat vectors in our systems and our applications today. We've also gone from having controlled access to a few systems to now where we've got less control over our distributed systems. Predictable flow control in the past to less predictable flow control, largely driven by the distributed systems that we've got as well. And there's also this move to move faster, be more agile, and the shift away from waterfall methodology to agile methodologies. So given this type of a context, and there are certainly other vectors that come into this as well, but if we look at this context, there are certain emergent threat modeling practices that we've been doing. Some are good, some are not so good. For the stuff that's working really well, let's not do anything with that. Let's just leave it. And let's move on and talk about those areas where perhaps we've got some challenges. So I'd like to focus in for a moment on emergent threat modeling bad practices, as a result of these pressures that we're experiencing. And I'd like to open it up, Spencer, from your perspective. Given the kind of pressures that we're under at this point, we still have to do threat modeling. But from your experience, what have you seen as some of these practices, whether anti-patterns or bad practices that have emerged?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest one for me is the death by 100 line item spreadsheet, when you're going through and looking at all of the different threat vectors that might exist or all of your mitigating controls. That type of massive inventory is extremely challenging to fit into a very rapid development workflow. So like that's not something I've used in quite some time, because while great is like a great like treasure trove of knowledge, to try to go through each individual threat vector and say, well, does this one apply? Does this one apply? It's too cumbersome, and honestly, like no dev actually enjoys doing that. So while it's great for some like it's great for a junior resource to learn to figure out, like, from a security or dev perspective, what are the types of threats that are out there. Eventually I end up boiling them down to different classes. And just like we have vulnerability classes, you don't have to know each and every single vulnerability type. You do kind of have to understand what are the different classes of actors or classes of threats. That's certainly useful. And focusing more on that higher level and being able to go through those types of flows and understanding how exactly does that class or does that generalization apply in this threat modeling exercise, that's extremely useful. So, certainly anything that's more than 50 line items long, I think people, I certainly start to glaze over. And so that is a bad practice that I would love to see forever go away.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's this whole there's a mindset of trying to achieve perfection here. We have to try and get everything right, every nook and cranny, and at the same time, we're trying to move quickly. So we've got dev teams that need to move rapidly, and then we've got the threat modeling activity that's kind of preventing us from doing that. It's not that the intent is malicious. We're just all trying to do the right thing. But how do we get these things synchronized in a way that kind of helps us achieve what we're looking for collectively? So let me turn over to you, Ihan. Any thoughts from you on some of these kind of anti-patterns or bad practices in threat modeling?
Uh, yeah, let me ask you this. I mean, when did we start kind of just discussing that the bad kind of just the areas of the threat modeling? Because I see that lots of organizations are still not adopting the kind of just the threat modeling over there, Altas. But wow, let me kind of just tell you this. There are many possible ways of performing the threat modeling, right? And the consensus is that there is unfortunately not one single perfect way of doing it. Right, as you know that in the past we did use Stride, we had PASTA, that's the process for attack simulation, and we have attack trees, and we have the CAPAC, the common attack pattern enumeration and classification, right? And there are many others that I cannot recall on top of my head. Among these kind of just things are there, lots of kinds of frameworks are out there. However, I think it is clear that there are some challenges in adopting those models, Altas, right? Because when we look at the organizations, forget about the good or bad, threat modeling is not being practiced widely over there, right? And when we look at the root cause of the problem, on why they are not kind of just the organizations are not adopting the threat modeling framework, we see that there are some fundamental issues over there, as Spencer kind of just mentioned some of them, right? And on top of that, what I would like to add is these frameworks usually take a single perspective on threats, such as, for example, the software development perspective, as it is the case in the Stride, or from risk perspective. This is the case for example, PASTA framework, right? And when you approach the threat modeling only from a kind of just the single perspective, then what you are doing, Altas, is you are limiting your model. The only thing that you can produce with that kind of just the model, one and done activity, which is of course expensive piece of documentation, and it is only created for just one group, whether this is kind of just your developers or security people or I don't know, risk people maybe. Right? The outcomes of your threat modeling should be meaningful and should be providing the value to the other stakeholders over there, right? If, for example, as a result of the threat modeling, you are not kind of just changing your design or you're not writing your test cases, and you're not kind of just controlling, adding any kind of additional controls, then you are not kind of just doing anything but eluding yourself, and you kind of just maybe pleasing to the regulatory requirements over that you are doing the threat modeling, right? Another kind of just the bad practice that I see is the kind of the models that we used to have, they are not supporting to the iterative and incremental approach there, right? They limit you to create at the front an exhaustive threat model document, right? Of course, I mean, as Spencer mentioned, during the kind of just the agile and DevOps kind of just the methodologies that we are adopting, this is not scalable, right? As the agile design process is allowing us to use the iterative and incremental approach, so our threat modeling should be doing this as well, right? So rather than we create the exhaustive threat model at the out front, right? And we have to kind of just do the threat modeling little and often so that we can see the benefit over there.
Very interesting. So that implies that, instead of going with this big bang approach, what we really want to do is we want to try and get these incremental components and use that and move that information. So at least we're not preventing people from moving forward, essentially, right? I want to talk a little bit about that, because one of the challenges that I've seen is this idea that especially when you go with this one and done type of mindset, is how do you update this model on an ongoing basis now? Incrementally, however, if you do it, these are bite-sized chunks, and it's taking that agile mindset and bringing that into threat modeling now. So it's not something that you take and you kind of hand over, but you're really looking now at a cross-functional approach of bringing everybody together, incrementally delivering this from multiple perspectives. And this allows you that feedback loop to update your threat model on an ongoing basis. Spencer, your thoughts on being able to update a threat model compared to kind of what you're seeing at this point?
Yeah, so I'm kind of of the opinion like threat models are kind of like network diagrams, where they're good once you actually ink them and then they're never forever correct. So I really liked where Ihan was going around. It's the like, what is the outcome of you doing that threat modeling exercise? What is that thing that gets taken away? And so I think the thing that I'm looking for when I do that with my teams is, are people understanding the way that we are thinking? Like, think about misuse, think about those scenarios that are often common and things that are relative, like important for the organization. So, probably fed in with metrics from maybe a bug bounty program or like past incidents or some sort of thing that tells you like, these are the types of attacks or types of scenarios that currently do happen. Right. So I know that is something that I will always focus on, and looking at things that I've completely ruled out. So a lot of us use frameworks. A lot of us have guardrails that are in place in our organization. I won't even bother with bringing those to the table if I know that I've completely eliminated a particular vulnerability class from worrying about from a threat perspective. So what I really want to see is, are my developers thinking about those types of misuses that are the problems and getting them trained to think about that beforehand, so that I don't have to just show up to a design document and like just redline everything. They've already addressed like, okay, we know what the failure modes are. We know how we're going to be handling authentication, authorization, like the common things that should be existing from both an architectural standpoint and from a threat perspective. Having that be the actual outcome in a doc that then makes it into code, that's what I feel is a successful threat model. Not necessarily that piece of paper that exists that has the title threat model on it. And now I have the benefit of not working in a regulated environment, so I am definitely lucky. But that really is the thing that I would want to show to auditors, is that we have completed that exercise and done value add into the process. That is a successful threat modeling process, not necessarily just a piece of paper that is outdated as soon as the next feature rolls around.
It's interesting you bring this up. I just want to look at our Q&A, and we've got some comments that have come in here. Indeed, the school of thought to mark everything as a potential threat where none exists. That's an important thing, right? And I want to touch on that a little bit further. Document the threats that are actually identified or have a high probability of manifesting themselves based on the architecture, controls, and environment. So we've got, we talked about some of these knowledge bases that exist in the industry. We've got CWE, we've got, good stuff that's being put out. Blindly taking these things and applying them to a model creates a lot of work, and we need to eventually come up with these mitigations. The question is, are these in fact really important? At the end of the day, when we're proposing these ideas, the goal of a threat model, at least from my perspective, I've seen it's shifting a little bit to focus more on the mitigations now, because there's actual capital expense attached with these mitigations. Ihan, can you talk a little bit about that? Are you seeing a shift from not just looking at the threats, but also validating and looking at the mitigations? Because this is where now we need to conduct some capital expenses.
Absolutely, Altas. And if you look at the kind of just the threat modeling, the ultimate goal is we are trying to kind of just reduce the risk over there, right? By addressing those threats, right? The most important thing here, right? Before kind of sort of discussing that, what I would like to bring to your attention is the success of the agile teams over there, right? As you know that the agile collaboration, what they are doing over there, they are dividing the task, and this multiplies to the success. And this builds the trust, and this trust is kind of just building to the speed, right? Same thing applies for the threat modeling, right? When we kind of just, as you know, that we are building a system, and it's a kind of just a collective effort from the many SDLC practitioners over there, right? And by bringing those stakeholders together, right, via threat modeling, actually what you are doing, Altas, is you are building a security-aware culture over there. You're promoting the security understanding across the whole team, right? It's not only the developers. Your business analysts are there, designers, developers, QA, your risk people, right? You know, they are the auditors, and the other, even the BCDR people are there that they can kind of leverage these threat modeling, right? So in a nutshell, you are making security everyone's kind of just a responsibility over there. And as such, we need to kind of just, if we give this notion that threat modeling, the outcome of the threat modeling is going to help our stakeholders to do their job better, then we are going to kind of sort of get to the more adoption on this. For example, we can use the threat modeling to drive the security requirements, right? Or from these requirements, we can create the abuse cases, right? And I'm going to kind of just explain whether this CWEs is kind of just helping or not, but before answering those questions, we need to kind of sort of take a look at which stakeholder is going to kind of sort of get what, right? And then we can kind of sort of discuss, are we going to get to the CWE only, or are we going to kind of sort of focus on the kind of prevention? But let's have a look at, for example, clearly see what the stakeholders will get, right? For example, the QA teams, they are going to kind of just perform the security testing by looking at those abuse cases that we built for them, right? Out of the threat modeling. Or the data gathered from the threat modeling, we can use them further in the risk management and the disaster recovery and the business continuity planning, and the crisis management can leverage those things as well, right? So the kind of the ultimate goal is facilitating the technology decisions over there, right? For example, you may identify maybe a high risk for a technology during the threat modeling, and you may say that you can take a look at the CWE and kind of just other kind of just the threat intel about that technology, and you may want to select another technology because it is less risky, maybe, right? So once we see this kind of just the different use cases and how the stakeholders can benefit from that, right? Then we can kind of sort of go what we are going to use, right? And how we are going to kind of just integrate this into the software development lifecycle, so that we can kind of just get the proper requirements at the design phase, and then we can facilitate the kind of just the technology decisions, what we are going to implement, and how we are going to test those with the negative test cases that we are kind of just producing, so that we can kind of help the SDLC practitioners over there. And again, there is no only one kind of just a source of information that you can kind of just take it and say, okay, I'm doing the threat modeling. Like, for example, some of the organizations are using those CWEs or maybe the kind of just the APTs out there, right? But you got to see the full picture, right? For example, yeah, you may get those, but how about the kind of just the compliance or privacy related things, right? What is your compliance requirements? If you are, for example, the PCI DSS compliant, right? Are you getting those kind of just the compliance related things from whatever the repository that you are kind of using, right? So there is unfortunately not only one resource that you can kind of pull and say that you are doing the threat modeling over there. There are multiple Altas.
Yeah, interesting. And I think, there's several comments that have been coming in here. So let's just take these comments one at a time. And I've certainly got some other things I want to bring in here. So the next comment is, indeed, Stride really has no place for control, compliance failures. systems and process disruption triggered from poor architecture or business controls. So we've got, we've had Stride. It was a framework. It was useful, is useful in certain contexts, right? To be able to go and to help us out. But let's talk about Stride a little bit. Let's talk about the strengths. Are there certain limitations of Stride? So Spencer, your thoughts on this? We've talked about multiple frameworks. I mean, the comment was on Stride, but we could just as much talk about Pasta, Attack Trees, Capic, any of these other things. What are your thoughts on limitations of the frameworks?
Yeah, I think we have discussed it a little bit too, right? Like around the audience, like who is that audience for? Stride is definitely a software engineering type of threat model geared towards how are we actually going to be writing code. And like, honestly, that's kind of the framework that we use at Reddit. And it serves its need because our target audience is a lot of software engineers. There is definitely not a place in there for controls, like how that control objective. But I also think that I want to decouple a threat model from a requirement session. Like they are often, I think, confusedly intertwined together. And I think there's a time and place for like, here are the hard and fast requirements, right? Like if I've got privacy requirements, that's not a threat model, or like the threat of of the ICO coming and getting me. That I wouldn't include, me personally as a practitioner, I would not include that on my threat model, because that's something that is happening kind of outside of what this thing that I'm trying to model is. Now, the beauty of a threat model is that you can frame it in such that, like, if we look at, okay, let's do the threat model for the org, there is a risk of the ICO putting fines on me. Okay, fair. That's a valid threat model, but it all depends on like the context of which you are doing that threat model. So, I think having a proper scope and knowing who the audience is, that definitely tailors towards what type of framework or what types of things you are pointing people towards to get them to think about the things that you want them to think about. Whether you come at it from a security perspective, you're coming at it from a risk and compliance perspective, right? Like I could totally envision a day where we get to a place where auditors and compliance people are like, here's this framework to think about threats from a risk and compliance standpoint, right? Like there's no reason that we couldn't do that. It probably is going to come because like everybody loves a threat model. It's a cool buzzword. But, for me, it comes down to what am I including the things that I want people to think about and want to get addressed from my perspective. And I am selfishly a security practitioner. So that's definitely like how I shade my types of threat models. But, could we include things that are compliance related or things along those lines? Sure. Why not? I think it comes down to like, there is no one perfect framework. There's no one perfect, because every organization is a unique snowflake and has different requirements and different ways of doing things and different things that they care about. So, for me, I look at like how we're doing it at Reddit. It's a hodgepodge of a whole bunch of different stuff that I'm like, this works for us. And this is something that gets me good value and is repeatable and doesn't have people yelling at me all the time because it's terrible. Like that to me is that definition of success. And we can just layer things on top as, going through just a very similar to an agile methodology for software engineering. I've changed my approach to doing threat modeling since I came here a year and a half ago, almost 2 years now. It's gone through a lot of evolutions in such a short time. So as long as you're adapting how you are doing that, I think you are also okay. You're doing a good job.
Interesting. Let's throw up that first poll then, Raquel, if we could. Let's find out from our audience, where do we fit in here? What best reflects your current approach to threat modeling? And it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this. I think we've been trained and coached on using Stride. We've grown up using Stride and data flows. But as we start to notice the confluence of these events happening, what else is out there? Can we do these other approaches? And there are different levels of maturity that are out there. So Spencer, you had mentioned using, for example, and even Ihan, I think you brought it up, misuse cases as an example. It's conversational. It goes, if we've got developers who are used to thinking in terms of use cases, then we just flip it on its head and say, what are some potential areas where this could be misused as an example? And how do we now mitigate against that? You're still conducting the same end goal. Achieving the same end goal here, which is to go in and try and identify areas that you need to mitigate against. It's just the approaches that we take is not that we have to deliberately go in there and create a data flow diagram, for example. So if we can just publish that poll, this is kind of what we saw. It's an interesting mix. We've got Stride and DFDs being where most are, just under half. And then we've got some folks that are exploring at this point, going beyond Stride and DFDs. And then we've got some that don't even use Stride and DFDs at this point. And so I think it, anyways, before I add my comments in, Ayhan, your thoughts on the results of the poll? Any comments?
You're right. I think many organizations are kind of start with the strides. Then after a week or two, they stop using the kind of just the threat modeling over there, right? And there are some reasons over there that I mentioned previously. For example, this is kind of just engaging only one group over there, right? You are not kind of just able to add the more kind of just the stakeholders while kind of performing a stride. Let me kind of tell one of my experiences. I think it was 7 or 8 years ago. I got hired as a kind of just a security architect, and I was doing a kind of just a threat modeling for one of the big telecommunications organizations. And once we are done, we were using this Stride, by the way. Once we are done, the kind of just the threat modeling, we did invite the different stakeholders and the business people and the other kind of just the stakeholders as well. One of the kind of just the business executive member told, you know what, I didn't like it, he said. And I asked him, oh my God, I mean, it's awesome. If these people know the threat modeling, I think they did find a mistake. I said, what you didn't like, right? And he told me that because we were kind of just putting the diagrams over there and kind of just, the spoofing and the other kind of just the things. Mm-hmm. First of all, he said, I didn't understand what is spoofing or the other things that you're talking, but I did not like the color of the diagram, he said, right? And then I realized that, you know what, I think whatever the methodology or framework that we are using from the threat modeling perspective, it should kind of just communicate to all stakeholders. It should be kind of just using a language that the business people can understand, that the kind of just the developers can understand, all the stakeholders can understand, right? Since the Stride and the other kind of just the frameworks are not providing this capability, then I think, again, what we are doing over there, are you doing a threat modeling? Yes, check mark, kind of just the thing that is providing to us these days, the Stride, right? Maybe we are going to talk about how we can kind of evolve and go beyond the strides, either today or in another kind of just a webinar. But Stride is not the only kind of, it's a good starting point, but it's not the only framework over there. And unfortunately, it's not scalable at all.
Ayhan? Sorry, Spencer, your thoughts on the poll, the results?
Yeah, I am not surprised. I think there are many blockers to actually start doing data flow diagrams and using a threat model. So I think the thing that I would comment on for the folks that are like, oh yeah, we don't do any of that stuff. More than likely you have, like when you're designing something or you're implementing something, you probably have architecture diagrams, because otherwise how do you know who is talking to what where? And an architecture diagram is like one or two steps off of having a data flow diagram. Right, like at Reddit, we are an AWS shop. All of our diagrams are with AWS architecture diagram specs. That is a minimum requirement as we are doing a design document proposal. Like you have to have a diagram to show what the heck is going on, because pictures speak 1,000 words. It's really not that hard to then take that to the next level or understand it from a security practitioner's perspective of, okay, what are the actual flows of data within this system? Because people want to understand that. So I think getting there is super easy. It's then just understanding, well, what value do you want to drive because you have that diagram? What do you want to point out, or what challenges, or how do you want to tell people about the way that they should be thinking about this? Anecdotally, like just last week, we were talking about re-architecting some of our Kafka pipelines within our data engineering practice. And we were talking, I was trying to explain to this engineers, like, okay, well, just think about where these boundaries are between your VPC and another VPC where you might have a consumer and producer talking to each other. And she's like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, I showed her the diagram. This is a trust boundary, because you don't trust these people over in the ads environment. You trust yourself in the data environment. That's a trust boundary. And she's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I now have a word to associate with that thing that I kind of understood anyway. So I think it's more of just figuring out how does it fit within your org, and then just like, don't, I love all of the architecture and literature that exists around threat modeling, but you come up with the way that your org should be doing it. right? And it doesn't necessarily need to be exactly what Microsoft says threat modeling is, or what anybody says threat modeling is. If you are doing an exercise where you're trying to figure out the failure modes and the things that you can do to make sure that those things don't happen, that's threat modeling. And you should take pride in that you are adding value to that process. Like my measure of success is if an engineer is like, oh yeah, I did not think about that failure mode, or I did not think about how I was going to handle data validation, or what, like something that they didn't consider. They're like, oh yeah, that I will now include that in my spec and make sure that gets done. Like, mission accomplished. Threat modeling has been a successful exercise. So it certainly comes in all different shapes and sizes. You just need to figure out what works for your org. And as long as you are proactively getting better, then you're doing an okay job.
Great. And just looking at some additional comments here, someone added in a comment here just to share that we do 3 different types of threat models. Level 1 is a characteristic based approach using like some kind of a BDA platform or like SD elements or something. And then level 2 is a diagrammatic based for top risk externally facing apps. So there's that classification thing that you were talking about, Spencer, and updating the characteristics based content with any new things that identify this. And then level 3 is going above and beyond and including network engineering, compliance, support. So really looking at threat modeling and trying to create different levels of how you could go about achieving this. Spencer, I see you nodding your head. Thoughts, comments on this?
I could not find the unmute button fast enough. I mean, I think of it just like security testing. Like you might do your big old external pen test every year, and you do that on a less frequent basis. And you might be testing, small features or small like actual endpoints, or like very, it's a way scoped down version of that actual pen test. So like, just like your security testing might be coming in all different shapes and sizes, your threat modeling is also coming in different shapes and sizes. And obviously the larger the scope, the larger the picture, the harder it becomes to do, and the harder it becomes to keep updated. Because anytime that you expand out, just think about it like from a computer's perspective. I don't understand how CPU architecture works, but I will use a computer. So like it's just, what is your frame of reference, and being able to abstract away those things, or say like, this is my system that I'm going to be focusing on, making sure the scope is correct. That helps drive getting that value out of a threat model, and having those multiple different layers like that. That's beautiful. Like that's actually exactly what we do too, because you can't threat model every single, like an entire platform. You can't do that every day. You could hire multiple FTEs to be able to do that. But you can't easily threat model a feature, and that doesn't take as much time. So as long as you're progressively building and you understand what your catalog of preventative measures are, and you understand what can go wrong, then that's the right path.
Yeah, interesting. There's another comment as well. Indeed, there are threats related to various software version, hardware, legacy concerns. And it's true, and sort of the true threat of out of support or open CVE is an issue. Much of my effort is to determine if a transitional mitigation is more appropriate than a corrective action. So for example, if the whole system is being replaced in 6 months, do we put in a filter to control or somehow, some other sort of gauze dressing and save the money and the effort of correcting that problem that eventually is going to get obviated? So the real issue is assuring that these old systems and temporary mitigations don't become permanent solutions, which is often the situation, right? Ayhan, your thoughts on that comment?
I feel that kind of just the pain over there as well, right? Putting the kind of just the band-aids over there during this kind of just the very rapid, just the system development cycles. And well, I mean, it's not going to kind of just rectify the root cause of the problem. You may definitely do that, and to reduce the risk to a certain level. But is it kind of just a long-term the feasibility is going to be there? No way. And what I recommend, instead of kind of just putting the band-aids over there, right? A broader kind of just the audience from each stakeholder needs to be there. And as you know that, I mean, why we are doing the threat modeling, so that we can kind of just identify the risk properly, right? Because it ties with the risk management, right? And kind of just to identify the risk, check your controls over there and apply those, and kind of just to find the residual risk, and take a look at your kind of just the organization's risk appetite. If it is within that boundary, then whatever you are doing is acceptable. But in most cases, in practice, you're not going to kind of just to see this, right? Then either a design change that needs to be done, because you are unfortunately getting a kind of just the technology debt over there, right? It kind of just accumulated over years and years, and you are trying to kind of just sort of fix that one. Good luck to you, right? That's why we need to kind of just start the threat modeling, and we have to kind of just apply this throughout the SDLC. And unfortunately, many people see this one as it should be done at the very beginning with the limited information. It's not the case. You have to do this at each and every step of the SDLC so that you can kind of get the benefit out there, right?
Interesting. So so traditionally we would limit threat modeling to just the design phase, but in fact, and I'm seeing this as well, Ayhan, is to look at threat modeling throughout the life cycle, and it's being done, it's being updated as we go through each of these stages. We might discover something in the coding phase, for example, which impacts our threat model. We may do something in testing. We might have something in compliance that comes up. And the question is, now that we talk about this cross-functional nature of all these teams dynamically kind of working together, this is where I'm seeing things evolving at this point now. And I think this might make sense to put up that second poll. Let's see, we've talked a few times today about this cross-functional nature of threat modeling, and let's find out, what do folks think? So I'm just going to update the spreadsheet here. So limiting threat modeling to just the design instead of entire SDLC. And in fact, it goes beyond that too, right? I mean, we're now starting to get into business discussions. We've already started to touch into things like compliance and risk and some of these things. So given that security is such an important aspect from a board level perspective, what value ultimately is threat modeling going to provide becomes the key question now. So if we can just display the results of that poll. Most have technical cybersecurity and non-technical professionals. So there is a cross-functional nature taking place. So, at least for the audience in this webinar, they're using this cross-functional team. Very few use just cybersecurity professionals only. And the next one is really some that are just starting out. About a third of them are just starting out on their journey. So we've got this broad spectrum, it looks like. Some have already moved into cross-functional threat modeling. Others are just starting the journey. And I'd like to see if we can leverage this information to help those that are in this webinar and maybe kind of take a look and see from a next steps perspective now. So we've really talked about, at this point, all of these practices, right? Just looking at all threat vectors is a problem, the difficulty in fitting into an agile workflow, trying to achieve perfection, the lack of understanding about what threat modeling is, trying to lock into one way of doing it, stride or pasta or attack trees, not taking multiple perspectives, using a one and done, lack of integration, no feedback loops, outdated as soon as it's done. So difficulties updating the diagram, for example, no connection to compliance, not speaking the language of other stakeholders, using a checkbox, not tying to risk, and limiting it to a given phase. Now let's flip over, and we've already started to discuss, so where do I go from here, right? There's a gap. We want to try and close this gap. And I was thinking that maybe we could do it in terms of the people, the process, and the technology aspects of this. And if we look at that, how do we go about, and let me try and create some more room for us here, where we could suggest, what are the things that we need to do to now start to help and create an approach that we can start to close this gap, not necessarily suggesting that we're going to do everything all at once, but incrementally, what can we start to do? So we started to talk from a people perspective, the idea that trust builds speed. It's a great notion, but what do we do specifically with our people? We've talked about building a security culture. And then we talk from a process standpoint about classifying the threats, providing value, thinking about common use cases, and maybe not having a threat model done for these common use cases, but build that into some way of people can sort of leverage it. Maybe it's, from a technology standpoint, it's this cross-functional knowledge base that provides the intel and the insights. But I'd like to kind of do a deep dive on this at this point. Ayhan, your thoughts on next steps, and feel free, you can jump across people, process, and technology. We don't need to stay in just one realm.
Okay. Yeah, everything starts with people. Let's get started with the people, right? The threat modeling is an extremely important activity. However, the executive teams needs to kind of just to support this, right? We need to kind of just to educate them the best way of kind of just to solving a problem, not to create that problem, right? I repeat this all the time, right? The threat modeling is kind of just providing exactly the same thing. We are kind of just doing the things properly, the right things, so that we are not going to get those, just to the 1,000 vulnerabilities when we do the kind of just to the scans, code scans, for example, if we are talking about the code, right? Or sometimes the worst is we are finding issues in the architecture and design that cannot be even changed, right? We have to kind of create the things from scratch, right? So education is extremely important. We need to show people, right, what they are going to kind of just to get from the threat modeling. And also that the executive team should be supporting this, right? And I'm kind of just surprised to see that 40% of our audience is kind of just saying that, okay, there are a mix of kind of sort of technical and non-technical people are coming together, right? That coming together is just kind of just in these rapid kind of just the fast-paced environments, it could be a challenging thing as well. So we need to kind of just show and teach those people how they can kind of just leverage some of the technologies over there, so that these coming together is going to kind of just do work better. And we are going a bit into the kind of just technology. You have to automate the things. You have to kind of sort of bring to the automated kind of just threat modeling or parts of the threat modeling as well, let's say, right? And also from the process perspective, let's keep in mind that threat models, these are all living documents, and they are all subject to revision because we are getting more information. The more information is becoming available in the later phases maybe, and it is subject to the revision all the time, right? So we have to kind of just to update based on the, I don't know, new cybersecurity threats, or the new type attacks, right? We need to kind of consider those, and instead of kind of doing one and done, we have to kind of just to constantly update our models over there, right? This is where you are going to get the most benefits, right? And also, again, maybe from the people perspective, we need to draw all the knowledge from different stakeholders. We don't only want that the developers or security people are doing the threat modeling, right? There's a huge knowledge over there from the other stakeholders. We have to get those. And how do we get that, right? Again, I mean, the meeting and kind of bringing those people into a meeting room or, the Zoom meeting is just very challenging. Everyone is just busy. So we need to kind of just find a way to kind of just to get their input in a self-served kind of just to the fashion, so that we can facilitate their engagement properly, right? Well, these are the kind of the most important things, but there are tons of things over there that it takes hours and hours to talk about that.
Yeah. Indeed, that's what I'm seeing as well. It's this this decoupling of the business architecture to provide the self-serve model where you go in, and if you're going to scale up now, what information can go in, which let's say it happens to be some kind of a mitigation. How does that mitigation for someone coming in, how does that mitigation translate into a requirement, or what does it mean from a test case perspective? Like, these are all things where this translation needs to happen. It's not about going in there and kind of blowing up the enterprise and saying, okay, now we need to kind of put everything back together. Rather, let's look at where we are today. Incrementally, what can we do? Let's start to create these, just as in software architecture. We've got adapters between components. From a business architecture standpoint, we've got these approaches that we can take that create adapters between process flows now. And that's essentially how we do it, with a focus on risk as an example, or cost that we've seen, which might be of interest to a CFO, for example, who's an executive, as an example. And it's interesting as I see where the industry is progressing, and I start to take a look at some of the discussions around evolving security paradigms like zero trust, for example. It's all headed towards this idea of business value, but while doing that, at the same time, as you enable the business, you can't forget about these other things like risk and compliance and things like that. So it's responsible application portfolios or responsible software development is kind of where we're headed at this point, and responsible in the sense that we're starting to inject other aspects from a business perspective, right? We have maturity in the development itself, and we've had that for some time. But what's new is trying to bring in some of these business ideas. Let me just pause there and kind of flip over to you now, Spencer. Your thoughts, next steps, what can we do as a security community, or even broader than that, as a community that is trying to help enable the business and still manage risk? What do you suggest as some concrete steps that could be taken from a people, process, or technology perspective?
Yeah, I'll totally reiterate what Ian was saying around the training of people. So for me, the threat modeling exercise is more of a mental model than it is a connect the dots type of exercise.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'll plug the guys over at Segment.io, like their way of doing threat modeling and training that out to the masses, so that I'm training product managers, I'm training engineers, I'm training safety people. Like, we are doing exactly that at Reddit. And it's been extremely eye-opening for some people to be like, oh, I never thought about, like, I never had that cognitive model about how to think about things. And I get it now because I've made it relevant to the organizational's working environment. So, like, as a social media platform, we care a lot about like moderation of content and making sure like terrible things aren't on the platform. People understand when you put it in that language of like, okay, let's threat model somebody posting a whole bunch of bad stuff. Like, what can be done? What are the mitigating controls? What are the types of behaviors or personas that like, people get it when you put it in terms of the business. And so whether you're a financial, like when you make product or got to have an e-commerce platform, like a lot of those things are very relevant, and people become aware that this is what threat modeling means. Like, I get the cognitive model now if you just give them a little bit of training and make it real for the org. So that is above and beyond. And Segment has like open source materials, like go out and do it. Like, I love it. I'm so glad that they did that. Totally use that as a foundational point. Moving to process. When I got here at Reddit, we didn't do any threat modeling. What we do now is something that glommed onto an existing architectural review process that is something that's been adopted by all of engineering, and that is the way to go affect change into production. And I latched onto that immediately. So figuring out what hopefully you have something. I mean, it would be kind of crazy if you don't, but that's another problem in and of itself. Latch onto an existing architectural review process and figure out how you can add elements of threat modeling, not necessarily saying like, we're going to have an hour meeting every time you want to do a new feature release, but just how can you intelligently and just iterate through adding things and ideas and concepts into that architectural review process that gets you closer to that threat modeling nirvana, like that, starting small and continue to ramp and building your repository of things that people care about. If you don't know what typical type of attacks happen to your org, or what typical type of mitigating controls exist within your org, then you need to start there and do that homework to know where you should actually care to look for different threats. Because if I've got, like if I have CSRF protection in all of my web frameworks that exist across the platform, I'm not going to worry about that threat of, an attacker being able to do a drive-by download click and affect change on platform. Like, that's just not a thing that I care about anymore, because I know some guardrail is taking care of that for me. Same thing with infrastructure components, like that expands everywhere. So understanding the guardrails your org has and being able to just shuffle things out of perspective that are threats, that's extremely important. And then looking at reusable patterns as well. So like we have certain golden paths, and I think Yelp had coined that term. Having golden paths for how you do things that have already been vetted, that have already what the threat model is, it's a good component that will reduce that risk. Being able to bring that to a table and plug those in from an architecture perspective, that's extremely helpful too. So like if you don't have that, that needs to be built to understand how you can reuse those components rather than having to re-engineer and re-threat model every single time.
Yeah.
And the last one I'll touch on is figuring out how to inject these types of concepts that you can update regularly. So, we're a Google Workplace shop. It's very easy for us to update the templates that people are using like on the fly. I've been at other orgs where we published a doc and then it wouldn't ever get updated for a year, right? So like that model does not work. Being able to update templates that people are reusing as part of that process on the fly as changes are being made, that's extremely helpful. So figuring out how you can easily make those tweaks and adjustments as you go on, rather than just saying, here's the document of how we do threat modeling and hoping that people will catch your next update. Figuring out how to automate that is extremely important.
Yeah.
And then, Ion mentioned like doing those async updates. That is so huge, especially as we're, a lot of us are in global workforces now. I've got probably 12 different time zones that I'm trying to struggle with to get all these updates. Our process is we've got a Google Doc that people get a week to review and update from an architectural review perspective. And our threat modeling is done as part of that architectural review process. And so people are able to async, add things. We've got comments, we've got an understandable pattern. If you don't have that, that's something that needs to exist. And that's helpful from an architecture standpoint as well. But that is how threat modeling should be done too. Being able to wrangle all of the cats that are developing whatever feature it is, like it's extremely hard. So if you can async it, then you're able to get that much more benefit. And even if it's, you might not be able to get the spark of ingenuity of people talking amongst themselves, at least getting the activity done via async, that's better than nothing at all, in my opinion. So
Yeah.
I would definitely take a look at that.
Wonderful. That's great. And with that, I mean, we've just pretty much come up against our time. So I'd like to turn it over to Raquel to gradually start to bring us to a land, and hopefully we can get to some Q&A as well. Raquel, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much again. That was a really great discussion. Before we get to the Q&A, though, I did want to quickly throw up one more poll question, and this one is more of a discovery poll for us. The poll we have here is, would you like to see how SD Elements can offer you a scalable alternative to diagrammatic approaches to threat modeling? And while that's happening, we can open it up to any questions. So the first question that I've seen here, and I know Altez, you were answering some as we went through the session, but the one we have here is, devs struggle with finding time. Can you talk a bit about how this helps them without slowing them down?
Ayhan, you want to take that first?
Absolutely. You're right. I mean, Davies is busy and the other stakeholders are busy as well over there, right? Again, the kind of just the secret here, this is the kind of just a collaboration, right? This is not only the dev that is going to kind of just come to the table for the threat modeling, right? And it's kind of a similar question from Rob. Whether we need to kind of do the validation as kind of part of the peer code review, right? Again, this is from the kind of development perspective that he's asking. Of course, we need to. However, this is not only from the development perspective, but the other stakeholders' perspective needs to be there as well, right? Each kind of just stakeholders has a, just a lots of experience in their specific domain that we have to combine them. As I mentioned, the success of the kind of just the agile teams are the collaboration and dividing the kind of just things into small chunks so that they can kind of just attack and kind of just complete in a timely manner. Same thing applies. As a kind of the developer, if you got involved in the threat modeling, right? Take a look at the kind of just the technologies, the programming language that you are using, or the kind of just the design that has been provided to you that you are building, and the requirements that has been hopefully coming from the kind of just as part of the threat modeling. And since you are the kind of the expert in that kind of sort of building that software, you know what's going to work, what's not going to work. So raise your voice and say that, you know what? I mean, I got this requirement, I got this kind of just sort of design, and I'm going to build this into the software, and this doesn't make sense. Raise kind of just your concern over there in a, of course, collaborative and kind of just a constructive way, so that you can get the whole kind of just the support from the other stakeholders. Right?
Yeah. I think for a long time we've had this bias towards limiting threat modeling to the design and analysis up front. And it's important. Architecturally, we need to know what the constraints are. As we start to consider security, if we limit security to just that aspect, then we miss out on a whole lot of value that could be injected, because security is, in essence, in what we're discovering, and even in this webinar today, it's cross-functional in nature. So to the point that threat modeling validation becomes a part of the pure code review process, absolutely. It's a way of going in and bringing developers on board. We may have a security champion that could use that as part of an ongoing training. The best kind of training is in situ. So while they're there, while they're going through this, as we explore the code and take a look at it, we can coach people. And in so doing, we end up moving towards a higher level of maturity from a security perspective. Spencer, your thoughts on this idea of how this approach can help from a development perspective?
Yeah, and the way I've always framed it is we can do that threat modeling exercise now and understand what are the things that we need to bake into the design and get it coded and implemented, or we can wait till the thing ships and then we can pay the debt of actually addressing the bug, pay the debt of context switching, because that feature, you may find that bug a week later, you may find it a year later, like it super depends. And now you're like, there's just I think everyone knows this, right? Like as the longer it goes for a bug to get detected, like the more cost it is from a dev perspective. That's a really easy sell. But if we just spend an hour up front of doing this exercise of thinking about the failure modes and addressing those ways that it can potentially fail and mitigating that we can then, reap that future sunken cost, like that has always been enough for me. And I've always had, there's not a single shop I've been in that I've been able to not find any anecdotal evidence to prove that is the scenario. So like, every org has bugs, and you just look at, well, if we had caught that thing up front, or if we had spent the time to do this type of exercise, I know someone in comment, like they do a lot of forensic threat modeling. If you had shifted that forward and paid that tech debt up front, rather than trying to do it after the fact, you save time, you save engineering, you save human the hours that are spent building that feature, that technology. It's just a no-brainer. It's just, really hard. It's one of those things. Security always has this struggle of, well, it's a risk reduction or something that eventually may happen. But I think it's just too easy to find references nowadays that like it actually is going to eventually happen within a very short time frame, while that person will still be at the company. So it just makes sense to do that. To which degree you go, that is the important part. Like that's the risk versus reward trade-off that we all have to figure out. How much threat modeling is enough threat modeling for your org and for the thing that's being built? Yeah,
interesting. And I think what I'd like to do is just close this with a comment that's in the Q&A here, and this is from Lauren. An ideal threat model team would include a lead and several interchangeable experts to support this chief modeling architect as needed. So for example, pulling in experts in Splunk or AWS or PCI DSS or CI/CD or other expert is needed. Right now, the pressure is that we're required to be the Swiss multi-tool of everything, one person. And this is in fact a team function, and it's best when we go in and we learn to collaborate together. And it's interesting that this is where the evolution is now taking place. We're seeing more of this starting to come in, as we saw, for example, with the initial injection of compliance into software development. So software development is becoming a business process in essence, which means we're starting to see more of these kinds of things now become injected in the cross-functional nature of how we produce software now. And with that, I know we're up on time here. So Raquel, I'd just like to hand it off to you to bring us to a land.
Yeah, well, thank you so much again. That was a great session and a great discussion. Just wanted to let everyone know that we will be providing the recording from this webinar to your email, and all of our webinars as they are scheduled will be added to the resources section of our website. So please visit again, and we would love to have you at another webinar. Thank you so much for attending. Stay safe and have a great day.